morning. Can you hear me? Hello? That didn't work then. Oh. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this morning's webinar. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes to see if we've got a few people trying to log in. We can put ourselves on mute for a moment, so just bear with us. Okay, I think we've got everybody, so that's great news. Quite timely this morning. Okay, let's start by doing a bit of housekeeping. I just want to make sure that our sound is okay. If you're familiar with using the webinar, if you've got the option to raise your hand to ask a question or to type in a question into the control panel on the side. So please feel free to use that. But let's just check the sound. If you can't hear me, can you raise your hand? Cool. Daniela, can you hear me? Okay, Danny, can you hear me? Seem to have a problem with Danny. I don't think she can hear me. I can hear her though. If you have problems with the sound and you can't hear us, can you just raise your hand? If I don't hear from you, I'm going to assume that everything's okay. Great. So, that's Danny. Danny, I'm assuming he's okay. Okay. Alison, if you can hear me okay, can you just raise your hand? Alison Atkinson. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Alison, for confirming that. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Oh, we've got a question. Just give me a second. Alison was hearing me now, but not anymore. No. Let me just get Alison Irving. Can you hear me now? I can hear you fine. Good. Right, that's great news. Right. Okay. Let's start then. You're all on mute, and I'm going to keep you on mute until you want to ask a question. And if you do want to ask a question, you've got two choices. You can raise your hand, and then I'll bring you off mute, and you can ask the question to the group, and we'll respond then. Or if you want, you can just type in a question, and we can answer that again to the whole group. So welcome to the EPA Pro beta training for IEPAs. This training is to talk about how changes that we want to make to our EPA delivery service over the next few months and the initiation of that. We've got two sessions today. It's quite a long day. There are 3 hours this morning, and I think it's slightly shorter this afternoon. So we've got an hour's break for lunch. We'll be taking plenty of breaks this morning because it is quite a considerable amount of time to be on a webinar. So we'll try and take hourly breaks for 5 or 10 minutes. so we can make sure that we don't lose anybody, and you can stretch your legs. We'll break for lunch, and then I'm hoping we'll make quite efficient use of time this afternoon, and we'll be able to finish a little bit earlier than planned. That was certainly how it worked yesterday. As I said, if you've got any questions, just raise your hand. Very informal. There are things. This training today is evolving. So there'll be feedback that we receive from our EPAs and LEPAs and the people attending the training that will mean that we update things. So please feel free to give feedback, and please feel free to point out when something isn't clear. I'm quite happy for you to do that as we go along. We'll also do some time for Q&A at the end as well. Okay, this material will be available after as part of a support package that we'll be giving to our EPAs. So please don't worry about taking notes. We'll update the slides and we'll send that out after the webinar. Okay, so without further ado, let me just introduce who we've got in the room. My name is Rachel Roberts. I work with the Associate Management Team. I head the Quality Assurance and Improvement Team. I've been working very closely to the project team. I've been part of that project, working on EPA Pro and the evolution of our EPA service. Jane Cowley alongside me. Many of you know Jane. She heads the Associate Management Team. I've also got Bill Twig in the room, who works on the current delivery of the EPA service. So some company in the room. It doesn't feel like I'm on my own talking to a screen, which is great. Okay, so without further ado, I think we've got a couple of associate managers on the line as well, so some people that you might know as part of the attendee list. Right, okay, so just to give you some context of what today's training is about and what we'll be doing. So our EPA service has run very successfully from quite small beginnings a couple of years ago into scaling up into the hundreds and thousands of EPA events that are happening now every month, actually, and that's been quite successful. The scale up has happened, and we've got a considerable amount of EPA events happening across about 52 standards. At this stock, though, as we prepare for scaling up further, we think it's time to review how we deliver our EPA service and reimagine it, and we want to put the customers at the heart of what we do. So we have put together a program of work, an EPA program, called the Darwin Programme, and the vision for the programme is on the screen. It's all about giving our customers the best endpoint experience we can, right the way through from registration to results, making sure it's profitable, it's efficient, it's effective, and it's market leading. And we're focusing that in our chosen standards. Now, in order to do that, the program of work that we've initiated is all about reimagining how we deliver our EPA service. And we are also putting a new piece of technology at the heart of that delivery. And we'll be adopting an existing platform called EPA Pro to support the delivery of that EPA service. So we're reimagining our business processes to match that technology and putting this new technology at the heart of the platform. Now, the platform is an existing product. It's already in the market, so it's being used by many of our customers anyway. And we've taken, this piece of technology, and the idea is that we review the processes that we have for delivering EPA, and we create this new service. Now, there are a number of reasons for that evolution. First of all, it allows us to offer an end-to-end digital service much more quickly to the market. As many of you know, we were working previously, we have a different range of platforms within our current offer, but the idea is that from registration to the release of results, we use one platform. It makes the customer experience much easier, much more simple. So the customer experience using EPA Pro will allow them to register and the release of results through one platform. And it's already in the market and it's very well received. The other reason for the evolution is that we want to make the employee experience better. The EPA Pro adoption and the new service, we believe, over time will significantly improve the employee experience because we will be less reliant on lots of manual manual steps around our technology to help deliver the EPA process. That is the objective over time. It will also help us to operate at scale. We know that we're scaling up and our EPA numbers will grow again this year. And part of our reimagining of the service is really to support that further scale up. And then finally, which is probably the most pertinent to you, is the assessor experience. We believe that EPA Pro and our new business processes will allow the associate, the IEPA, to have more ownership over the scheduling of the assessments. And this will help them to better support, the management of their own time. Okay, so they're the sort of key reasons for the change. Now, the rollout of this new service, I'm going to call it a new service. We will still be delivering thousands of EPA events on our current service, but we're rolling out this new service and the new technology initially at small scale. And a lot of work has already been done so far to support with that. We've done a lot of work over the last couple of months to look at our business processes and to explore how they need to change with the new technology. We've completed that work. But those business processes will evolve as we start to use the technology and start to roll out the service. We've done some testing of those processes and some testing of the new system through December. We've completed that to check that everything works as we expect it to do. And we're now in what we're calling a beta phase, which is starting in January, which is where we'll go live with the new service at a very small scale with 3 customers on 4 standards. And we, from the 27th of January, will be starting to accept new booking for the new service. And we'll be completing EPA assessments through the new platform following the new business processes. Once we've completed that, and it's difficult in the minute to predict how long that phase will be, because we expect there to be a lot of learning from this phase, we'll be looking at how we want and need to then roll out the new service across our other customers and other standards. But currently we're on the beta phase, and as I said, that is quite small scale, and that's where our focus will be today. Okay, so why are we here? What's the objective of this training? So as may have been made clear to you in the communication of the training, this is really about me explaining to you the context and the objectives of this EPA Pro training. We started to talk about what EPA Pro is, and we've talked about us wanting to reimagine our EPA service. This training will provide you as a group of IEPAs who've been selected to support with the rollout of this new service and the beta phase. It will give you as IEPAs an overview of the processes to accept, manage and complete an assessment for an EPA event on the new service using the new platform. It will involve, this morning's session is talking very much about the new processes, how the new service will work, and the role of the IEPA in that service. And this afternoon, we'll be looking at the IT system, and you'll get the opportunity to have a demonstration and a walk through the different processes of how to use the IT system. So you'll see that being used live. It will also be an opportunity for us to talk a little bit about the feedback that we'd like from the IEPA through this beta phase, following training and also through the beta phase. Because, as I said, it's small scale, and it's really about testing out our understanding of how the processes will work and the system. So it's really important that you, as IEPAs, are some of the key users of that system and some of the important key sort of stakeholders in that process will be able to give us some feedback as to how things are working and give us the opportunity to understand how we need to learn lessons and improve things as we go forward. This training, as I've said, will also be an opportunity for you to ask questions and give feedback. But what I'm going to give you today is, it's a training package, but it will evolve over the next couple of weeks as we respond to the feedback that you give and as we prepare for the start of beta. So this morning's session, as I said, is 9:30 to 12:30. We'll talk about the EPA service, how it's going to evolve, and the beta phase, and your role as an IEPA, and the changes to the process, and the kind of support that you'll get through this. We'll have some breaks through the sessions. I've said a mid-morning break there, but I think we'll break every hour because it is a considerable time sitting and listening. And then this afternoon session starts at 1:30, and we'll then have a walkthrough of the technology and a chance for you to see how that will work for the IEPA and the LEPA. Okay. So before I move on, it was a very quick run through a bit of the context for today's training and some of the objectives. Any questions or any hands raised or any sort of points that anybody wants to make at this stage before we start? No? Okay, so I'm going to take silence as a good thing. I'm going to move on. All right, so beta. So I've used this word beta. What is the beta? The beta is, as I said, a small scale go live of our new EPA service using the EPA process system with selected customers, IEPAs and apprentices. This go live will give us the first opportunity to understand how the system and processes can work in a live environment and how they need to evolve further to support the delivery of that service. So we've got 4 standards across a small number of customers, and your standard today is the customer service practitioner at level 2. So when is this going to happen? Well, the beta is planned for go live from the 27th of January. That means that from that point, we are expecting to receive bookings for apprentices. Now, we don't expect this to be a big bang. We've got predicted numbers through February and March, and we expect there to be a sort of slow trickle of registrations initially, and then for that to increase as we move through February and into March. So even if go live is on the 27th, we don't expect to suddenly have 100 people using the platform at that stage. So what will you be asked to do? As I said, you've been selected as a group of IEPAs working on this standard because we're keen to work with you and understand how the system works for you and where we need to evolve. So what we'll be asking you to do is to attend the training. This is the first session, but there will be subsequent training sessions on different parts of the technology and some additional information that we need to give you later in the month. And we'd like you to also review any training and support materials that we provide to you. So all of the materials that you get today will be provided in a deck, and we'll also be putting a package of support materials and guidance together. So part of what we'll be asking you to do is to look through that and to get familiar with it, so you feel comfortable using the new EPA Pro service. Once we go live, we'd like you to accept, if your timetable allows it, some of the EPA allocations that are offered to you through EPA Pro. So you can start to use the new system and start to deliver EPA through the new processes. We'd like to carry out the assessment as you would normally do, as per the training that you've been given. And then, as I've said, we'd also like you to provide some feedback on our processes and the functionality of the system. And also the training and the preparation that you get in advance of going live, just so we can understand how that needs to evolve and how we can improve that going forward. Okay, any questions or any points at this point? Okay, that's good. So, very quickly, just a review of some of the key stakeholders in the process, in the new process, but also in the current process actually. The IEPA, the assessor, that's you, and that it's your role to schedule assessment dates, carry out assessment of apprentices, and provide fair feedback on apprentice performance. That will be your new role. We'll talk more about this, but I just wanted to give you an overview. The EPA events booking team, their role will be to provide you with allocations of EPA events, to provide support in booking GoToMeeting events, and to provide technical support to both the IEPA and the customer as you move through that EPA event and associated activity. So that doesn't change really, but there's a slightly different focus for them, which I'll talk about in more detail. The LEPA, that role doesn't change. It's about quality assuring the work of the IEPA and providing technical support and guidance, and then releasing the results to the customer, approving that result to be released. associate management team. You work with these people very closely, recruitment, training, standardization, and the preparation for our IEPAs to deliver this, the EPAs through this new service. That's their key role. And then there's the EPA gateway team. So as you probably already know, these people process the gateway applications and make sure all of the criteria have been met, so the apprentice can proceed to their EPA event. So similar key stakeholders, but the focus changes slightly. Okay, so just a quick summary of what is probably the most different about the new service in terms of EPA Pro and going forward. So currently, the EPA event booking team has a key role in allocating events to the IEPA based on their availability, and then a role in making sure those events are scheduled correctly, so that they have information from the customer as to when they want to do the event. They liaise with the IEPA to check their availability, and you've got this kind of middleman role working between the customer and the IEPA to schedule the different components of the endpoint assessment. And that's currently how it works. In the future, the key differences will be using EPA Pro as a platform, but as you can see, the position of the IEPA has changed in this, and what we'll have is that the IEPA will play a key role in deciding the scheduling of the endpoint assessments directly with the customer. The EPA booking team will allocate a case to the IEPA based on their understanding of the IEPA's availability and what their caseload is currently and where their location are, and then the IEPA would accept or reject that case based on what they know about their own timetable. Once they've accepted the case that's been allocated to them, or they may reject it, but assuming they accept it, the IEPA will then work directly with a contact in the customer to schedule the individual components of that endpoint assessment. So if there is an interview, they will schedule the dates for the interview. And so there's a much more direct relationship. And throughout that process, the EPA events booking team will be supporting that activity, but it is very much that scheduling will happen directly between those two key players. What we envisage is that this will allow that scheduling activity to be much more efficient. Currently, acting as the middleman, there's a lot of back and forth between the different players, making sure that the availability of the customer and the apprentice matches the availability of the endpoint assessment. In the new world, this will happen much more directly, so we envisage this scheduling is much more efficient. And we're going to talk more about that and what it means further on this morning, but I just wanted to pause to see if there's any questions or any points that anybody wanted to raise. Okay, good. I'm assuming you can all still hear me. Moving on. Okay, so very briefly, I'm going to give you an overview of the assessment process in the new world. It's very similar in places to how we currently deliver the service, but there are some key differences, as I've already indicated. So initially, a caseload is allocated to an assessor. Now this could be an apprentice or a number of apprentices with a particular provider, and the EPA events booking team will allocate those to assessor based on some understanding of the assessor's availability. So they'll work with the assessors quite closely, and they do currently. There is an availability hub where the assessor puts some of the general information about their availability. So that case can be allocated to the IEPA based on some insight and intelligence about their activity. But the IEPA gets the opportunity to accept or reject that case or those cases based on what they understand, their sort of up-to-date view of their availability. We're hoping that because the EPA events booking team will have some prior understanding and may have a conversation with the IEPA in advance of allocating, that we increase the chances that the IEPA will accept that case. So it's allocated, and let's assume that the IEPA accepts the case they've been given. What then happens is that the IEPA will meet remotely with the provider. This will be something called a planning meeting, and the key focus of that planning meeting is to determine the dates, the different assessment methods that sit within that endpoint assessment. So that event will take place between the provider and the IEPA directly. So as you can see, the scheduling is happening very much there. And there may be some other players in that planning meeting, which we'll talk about a bit later, but the key focus of that is to set the dates, locations and times for the different assessment methods for the range of apprentices that the IEPA has been allocated. The next step is that the assessments take place, hopefully according to the schedule that has been set. And the IEPA, in the same way that they do now, would use the evidence that is provided or the evidence that they observe to make a judgment on the different assessment components that the apprentice sits. The results, and where appropriate, any failed feedback, is entered onto the platform for each assessment. Another key difference, which again we'll talk about in more detail, is that the results are, instead of being released at the end of the endpoint assessment event, they will be released for each component. So if, for example, there is a professional discussion and that sits alone as an assessment method, then the results for that will be judged and entered into the platform, and once they've been quality assured, they will be released to the customer at the end of each assessment method. Just got a question. I'm going to stop. Kelly, there is, so Kelly's asked me a question. I'm just going to put that question to one side, Kelly, because I'm going to answer that. So just bear with me a second. As we just move through the rest of this process, as I've said, the results for each component are entered into the platform, and the LEPA would quality assure those results and then release them. And a key difference between the new service and the current service is the results are released for each individual component. Once all of the assessment are completed, and assuming there aren't any resits to take, the IEPA would then work out the overall result for that endpoint assessment. It would enter that onto the platform, and in the final stage, the LEPA would quality assure that result, and the result would then be released to the customer. So that gives you a very sort of high-level summary of the steps in the process, and I will be talking in more detail about all of these steps. But at this stage, are there any questions relating to that assessment process? Or any points that anybody wanted to make?
Just one from me. At the point where it is allocated and have the first interaction with the customer, what happens if the assessor can't satisfy the customer's requirement?
Okay, so we'll come on to that when we talk about the planning meeting, if that's all right. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Right, so just a quick summary of some of the key changes I've already highlighted, but I wanted to underline. So on the current process, the EPA booking team set the assessment dates based on the availability of the IEPA, and they act as the middleman between the customer and the IEPA on setting those assessment dates and rescheduling them where they need to. In the new world, for beta, the IEPA will own this process, and they'll be able to set the assessment dates directly through a planning meeting with the provider. I'll answer that question now, actually, Bill. So Bill asked, what happens if in that planning meeting they can't satisfy the requirements? I think the way that we make this work is that actually the EPA booking will do what they can before they allocate to understand the availability of the IEPA, to increase the chances that that allocation is a success. In reality, it could very well be that if they have a planning meeting and the IEPA availability is limited, or the customer availability is so limited they can't be flexible, it might mean that allocation has to go back and they have to allocate it to a different IEPA. Makes sense?
Yeah, so the system will allow the IEPA to go back to the LT to say that it can't satisfy the requirement. Okay.
So key change in the current world, the EPA team are playing the middleman in that booking. Currently, for beta, for the new processes, the IEPA will own that process, and they will set those assessment dates directly with the provider. In the current world, all of the assessment documents are stored on learning systems, so they're all in one place. Now, for beta, we are having to do things slightly differently. So there are two types of assessment documents. There are assessor documents that are part of the IEPA's evaluation of that learner. So they might be the assessor observation forms, or they might be the recordings of any go-to meetings that are happening. And they're the documents that the assessor uses to make a judgment on that apprentice. There are also a set of documents which are submitted by the customer. This could be a showcase portfolio, for example, on behalf of the learner, and they form part of the assessment evidence. So in the current world, as I said, everything is stored on LA. Currently, in the new system, we are only able to share documents on there that can be shared with the customer. So the documents that we'll be putting on EPA Pro are things like the failed feedback form. EPA Pro also allows provision for the customer to upload portfolio evidence, so that will also be on EPA Pro. However, any of the internal documents that we are using for the assessment, so the assessor observations, the recordings, will need for beta phase to be stored on SharePoint. We're having to use another system alongside EPA Pro initially to store all of the assessment documents in one place, because currently the system doesn't allow us to do that. Now we are exploring how this works through beta, and the idea is that we work towards having a single location for all of these documents. But initially through beta, at a small scale, we'll be using two different locations for some of the documents. But we'll be saving everything in SharePoint, but we'll also be putting certain documents that can be shared with the customer on EPA Pro. I'm going to stop there because there's a question. Okay. Okay, Veronica, I'm going to come back to your question again because it is it's relevant, obviously, to the conversation, but I'll need to get through some more of the presentation before I do that. So just apologies for that. Okay, so as I said, this phase is temporary for beta, but I wanted to highlight that for you. It's not ideal, but we are working at quite small scale. And part of what we're trying to understand in beta is how we need this to work to make it an efficient process for IEPAs and for our customers. Another key change, which is, I'll come back onto Veronica's question in a moment, is the EPA results are released once all relevant assessments are completed currently. In the new world, what we're saying is that EPA results will be released once each assessment has been completed. Now, I'm just going to pause there because Veronica had a question. Veronica, I'm going to bring you in, actually, because I think this is worth a discussion. Hi, Veronica.
Oh, good morning. Hi there. Thanks for that.
No worries. Do you want to repeat your question to everybody?
Yeah, thank you. So it was just regarding the point about the release of the results after each component has been completed. So our IEPAs carry out an assessment of the showcase, and currently that's not great. It doesn't get graded until after the interview has taken place, professional discussion, actually on the day of the endpoint assessment. So my question is, once that initial assessment of the showcase has taken place, it would kind of need to be grade pending the final EPA. So does the system allow for that to be held or to be on hold until the EPA has taken place? Because we certainly wouldn't want to release any results after the assessment of the portfolio, because that grade isn't determined until after an interview or PD has taken place?
Yeah, it will allow for that, Veronica. And I think part of what we need to understand is that there are lots of different standards with slightly different requirements. Customer service is one of those. Just a quick question for you, and just something I wanted to clarify. And I was talking to the AMs about this morning. So in terms of customer service, are there 4 different assessment components for your particular standards?
No, there's 3 components. There's the showcase portfolio, the practical observation and professional discussion. But the showcase portfolio is not graded until the interview has taken place. So the interview is not graded, but contributes towards the grade of the final grade of the showcase. So there's 2 parts. There's 2 parts to the showcase, if you like. It's now called showcase portfolio with interview.
That is fine, actually. So it will allow us to do that. So I just need to adjust my explanations as we move through the presentation. But in theory, so if you can imagine, there are 3 components for customer services. We would aim to release for all the standards that we can. We'd aim to release the results for each component after they've been completed. But if there are 2 interrelated components, then it's possible for us to hold the result for one until we've completed the assessment on the other, and then to release them both at the same time.
Oh, okay, that'd be good, because in all honesty, once the IEPA has gone out to do the endpoint assessment, they carry out an observation and a professional discussion, and that professional discussion potentially changes the grade for the observation and in the showcase as well. So they are all interlinked and compensatory. So in all likelihood, for our standard, the IEPA would come back and all 3 results would probably most likely be released together when they do their last bits of paperwork.
And that's fine, actually. So that and I will adjust my explanation as we move through, because in that case, that releasing by component is less impactful for your standard than it is others.
Yes.
Because in all likelihood, as you've just said, the 2 components that are on site, you do them the same day. And so even if you might be looking at and saving documents and working with each of the components, the results won't go out until the end.
In most likely, yes. In all cases, I mean, the only other exception would be perhaps for a resit, where it's an individual component done and we can release that. But obviously, that's a different story. But for a normal EPA, it would be most likely the IEPA would make their decision on all 3 components once they get back from that visit.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you for that, Veronica. That's really helpful. And for everybody, actually. So we've tried where possible to make this relevant to as final as it will be, but there will be things that we learn. I'm just going to get back on me, Veronica. There will be things that we learn from you as the experts, actually, as we do this training, that will mean we might need to tailor our approach slightly for different standards. So, as Veronica's just explained, overall, we're looking to release components once all the relevant assessments are completed, but actually, for your standard, that activity happens very close together anyway, so that actually feels like we'll be releasing the results together. The failed feedback, we've said, and this again is relevant, is released to customers once all EPA assessments have been completed. But again, because your assessments are assessed together, in reality, that will be released all together. But we are asking our EPAs to prepare failed feedback for each of the components rather than the endpoint assessment overall, because the failed feedback will be attached to the components. So if you've got, for example, a showcase portfolio that fails as part of that endpoint assessment, the failed feedback is attached to that individual assessment rather than being provided for the overall assessment. Okay, so the EPA booking team currently reschedule existing bookings and set reset dates. As I've said, though, the EPA booking team, the events booking team, they won't own the process. So any sort of reset dates or reschedule, it will be for the IEPA to work directly with the customer to do that. And then finally, GoToMeeting is organised currently by the EPA events booking team. That's the current process. But actually through beta, there won't be any change initially, but what we'd like to do through beta is to evaluate whether there is any value in that being organised directly by the EPA. We've had some feedback which says actually, it takes more time for me to ask the team to set up the booking than to do that myself. So part of what we'd like to do through beta is to evaluate whether that can be organised directly by the EPA and whether that will save time and be more efficient for them. So that gives you an overview of some of the key differences. Can I stop at this point to see if there are any questions or any comments? There's a hands up, just bear with me a second. Just need to find out who it is. It's Veronica. Hi, Veronica.
Sorry, it's me again.
Sorry, it's all questions are good, and it's really how we learn, so that's good.
It was just around the failed feedback, and you mentioned about that also being released as each component is completed. So going back to what I said earlier, when our IEPAs come back and they make their assessment decisions, that's the point when they would make the decision on which component had failed. So in our case, potentially there could be all three failed, or after the EPA has taken place, would we, if there was say 2 components that had failed, the observation and the PD, you'd still want that feedback uploading separately. So observation feedback went as one document with the results of the observation, and the fail feedback for the PD separate, rather than as we do it at the moment on one document.
Yeah, I'm afraid so, Veronica. So how the system works is that fail feedback goes out for each component. So what I'm hoping is that there isn't more work. The only additional work is that it has to be uploaded against a separate component.
Yeah.
In terms of the content, it would be a case of splitting the content. So the content that's relevant to the showcase would go on that assessment component, and the content that's relevant to the interview would go on that one, and it would need to be uploaded separately. That's because the system works to release feedback by assessment component rather than overall.
Okay, that's fine. So we just separate it out into, if appropriate, into 3 separate documents, 3 separate uploads, and they get the feedback separately against each component.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that for them, I appreciate that does mean a bit of extra work in terms of uploading it. But in terms of the content, what we don't want is to have any repetition of the content. It's just the part that's relevant to each of the assessment matters would be matched to that component to be sent out. Does that make sense?
It does, yes, thank you.
No worries. Okay, any other question? I'm just going to put you back on mute. A second. It helps the sound.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, any other questions from anybody? Hands up. No? All right, so we can move on. Right, so just wanted at this point to underline a point that I've made already, which is that we are, for beta, we'll be working with 2 key systems. There are others, which I've mentioned, but the 2 key ones are EPA Pro. As I've already said, customer registration and booking will be done through EPA Pro. And then it will also be used to allocate cases. And when I talk about a case, what I mean is an apprentice to do an endpoint assessment. So EPA cases will be allocated to IEPAs through the EPA Pro system. And the IEPAs can use the system to accept or reject those cases. In terms of booking assessment dates, that will also be done through EPA Pro. So as I've already said, that's a scheduling activity, and EPA Pro is used to capture that information. And it's also used for the customer to submit any learner evidence. So Veronica's just spoken about the showcase portfolios. That will be used to submit, irritating cough. That will be used to submit, the customer will use the platform to submit that learner evidence. Assessor judgments and the provision of failed feedback will also be provided to the customer through EPA Pro. So through their access, that is where they will receive that information. And also the quality assurance, so the LEPA will be able to quality assure the outcomes that the IEPA has given to those assessments through EPA Pro. And then finally, the issue of those results to customers will also happen through the platform. So there's a real end-to-end process for the customer in terms of that new system. Now, for beta, as I've already said, because there are some limitations currently in how EPA Pro accepts or stores assessment documentation, What we'll be using SharePoint for is to store all of the relevant assessment documentation for that particular apprentice, and we'll be doing that through Beta. And that's everything, because we'd like to keep all of the documentation in one place. So go-to-meeting recordings from interviews, if that's relevant. I don't think it's relevant to your standard. Your assessor observation forms, any feedback that we're doing. We want to store all of that on SharePoint so it's in one place. And that SharePoint site will be used to share that documentation with LEPAs for quality assurance and with our EQA bodies if they're doing audits. And that's currently in place for Beta, but we'll be looking at how that needs to evolve going forward. So SharePoint will be our single source of all documentation. However, there'll be certain documents that we'll also be putting on EPA Pro. So the fail feedback, for example, because that can be provided to the customer through EPA Pro, we'll be putting it in SharePoint as a single source of all our documentation, but we'll also be putting it on EPA Pro so it can be sent out directly to the customer. Now that's currently what's in place for Beta, and I just wanted to underline that. We'll be talking more about this as we go through the process, but I just wanted to underline that there are these two key systems for Beta. There's also Walled Garden, which is what the customer uses to book Evolve tests, and there's also GoToMeeting, which, as you know, is the software that we use for remote assessments. And it will be the software that we will use to have planning meetings with the customers, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. I have a question. Let me just get rid of the questions we've already answered. Okay, so this is a question from Alison Atkinson. Is the IEPA availability stored on EPA Pro? Okay, so currently it's not stored on EPA Pro. There is some information about the IEPA availability, which is about the days they can use, but it's not very sophisticated at the moment. It also gives information about the caseload that they have and their location. So that will help the EPA booking team, events booking team, understand some of the key criteria. But currently it doesn't have any more information about the IEPA availability. So for the Beta, we would like the IEPAs that are involved in the Beta to make sure that they maintain their availability on the current site that is used. And I think that will allow the EPA events booking team to understand their availability before they allocate a case, and that actually helps improve the success of a case being accepted. So for the Beta, we would like the IEPA to maintain their view of availability on the current system. Thank you for that, Alison. Hopefully that answers your question. If it doesn't, raise your hand. So I think at that point, I'm just going to take a 5-minute break, only because I feel like I need to get a glass of water. So I'm just going to use this moment to have a 5-minute break, and I'd like us to reconvene just before, let's say at 10:30, if that's possible. We'll have a break now, and then we'll start talking through some of the detailed processes that we have. So if you just bear with me, take a break, stretch your legs, make a cup of tea if you want to, or coffee, and we'll be back at about 10:30. Great. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. I'm sorry about the slightly 1 minute late. Okay, so if we, so I've just moved on. We just take the slide back one, so we end up where we finished off. So we just started talking about the IT systems, and I mentioned that they were two different systems, and then I also spoke about the fact that there was GoToMeeting and Wall Garden. So there were a couple of questions at this point. I'm just going to bring those up. I seem to have lost the questions. Give me a second. So I think Linda had a couple of questions. Here we go. So Linda, you mentioned that the IEPAs had been chosen. Will the LEPAs get a list of those who are involved? Yes, once we finish the training, the people that have been invited to the training and the people that will have availability to be involved in the beta, we will get that list to each of the LEPAs, because that's important that you get that. Okay, so will the IEPA speak to the provider or the employer or both? But I think you're talking about the planning meeting there, Linda, so I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So if you bear with me a second, we'll come on to that point. Kelly, I haven't forgotten about your question either, so we'll come on to that now. Okay, so moving on. So just a quick overview of the assessment methods for customer service. As we've said, we're offering across 52 standards, and there are very subtle differences in the delivery across these standards, which will have an impact slightly on how we use EPA Pro and also how we manage the processes. And I think Veronica drew attention to one of the key features of your standard, which is slightly different to some of the others. So as I understand it, there are three different components for customer service level 2. The first is a showcase portfolio, try and get my teeth back in. A showcase portfolio that's submitted 10 working days prior to the interview date, and the interview date, as far as I understand it, tends to happen at the same time as the professional discussion. That portfolio is assessed, but that time in the interview at a later date is used to just get some clarification and fill some gaps. But that is an assessment in itself. So the first assessment method is the showcase portfolio, and it's linked to one of the face-to-face meetings that happen, because that face-to-face meeting is used to confirm the result of that showcase portfolio. And when Veronica was talking about releasing results, that's what she was referring to. The second method is the practical observation, that happens on site, and then finally the professional discussion, which also happens on site too. And it says that this is the last assessment component. Now I've put those things up because the sequencing of the assessments and the assessment plan for each of the standard drives the scheduling activity between the IEPA and the customer. So for example, if this is the last component, when you're setting dates, you wouldn't want to set this first, for example. So it's important that we have that in mind. And these are different for each of the standards, of course, so there will be slight differences between this and some of the other training that we're doing at the moment. So any questions at that point, or any points that I've missed, any clarification? I'm hoping that my understanding is clear. Good, okay, I'm going to take silence as a really positive thing and move on very swiftly. Okay, so let's start to talk about in detail how the new processes will work. We'll work through the slides. Now, there's quite a lot of information on these slides, just to say, and the reason for that is that this slide deck is used also as a support tool once we finish training. Now, I know some of the slides are quite text heavy. I will talk you through them as clearly as I can, but we've put a lot of information on the slide so it can then be used as a resource to support you, just to make you aware of that. Okay, so she says, coughing again. So the first part is where the EPA events booking team will allocate to an IEPA a case or cases. And as I've said, a case or cases is an apprentice who needs to do an endpoint assessment. And that allocation will be based on the understanding of the IEPA's availability. either currently from the platform that the IEPA will keep up to date with their availability, but also from some information in EPA Pro. EPA Pro, for example, will show the allocated cases and what stage they're at, and it will show the location of the IEPA and the location of the assessment. So they will be allocating cases to the IEPA, and they may even have a conversation with the IEPA in advance, especially if they have a block of apprentices in a particular provider that they want to allocate to an IEPA. They may have a conversation with the IEPA in advance to get that understanding. Based on that allocation, the IEPA can then reject an allocation if it doesn't suit them, and this would then go back to the EPA events booking team, and they would then have to reallocate that to a different IEPA. And that would happen all the way through the process. Now, ideally, if an IEPA would accept the case, we would expect them to take that through to the end point. But things happen, you know, things come up in life, and if something does happen, and if we can't find assessment dates that suit both the IEPA and the customer, as Bill highlighted, that case would need to go back to the EPA events booking team, and they would need to reallocate it. As I've said, just to highlight, if there are a number of apprentices, the EPA team may have a conversation with the IEPA to get a sense of whether they can cope with a certain number. If the IEPA accepts an allocation and then later has to reject it, they can do that on the system, but they'll also need to let the EPA booking team know by email to highlight that, because obviously if that does happen, it's in everybody's best interest, especially the customer, to make sure that case is reallocated as quickly as possible. Once the IEPA accepts the allocation, they then proceed to the next stage, which is something called the planning meeting, which we'll talk about in a moment. I've got a question, so I just need to check. I'll come on to your question afterwards, Kelly, if that's all right. Okay, some really good questions coming this morning. Excellent. So moving on to the next stage. Now, this is what I've called the planning meeting, and hopefully this is where I answer one of your questions, Kelly. So the planning meeting is what it says it is. It's a meeting that's set up by the IEPA to agree the dates, locations, and attendees of each individual assessment method that makes up the endpoint assessment. Now, from when the allocation is accepted by the IEPA, we would expect the planning meeting to take place within 10 working days. And that's what we're aiming for. And we're testing out that concept through beta. So we put that as a marker in the sand, and we need to observe and monitor how effective that is through the beta and whether that's possible. But we would like it to take place within 10 days. Now, I use the word meeting, but it is conducted remotely, and it is a conversation conducted remotely using GoToMeeting, so people can attend from different locations. Now, the key attendees at that meeting are the IEPA and the provider, but that meeting may also be attended by the employer and the apprentice, or apprentices if we're talking about a block of apprentices. It really is up to the provider as to how they manage that. And some providers feel that it's much more efficient to do this minus the apprentice, and the GoToMeeting planning meeting would take place predominantly between the provider, IEPA, maybe with the employer. And some people may want the apprentice there, not because they get a chance to have a preview of the assessments, but because it's important for them to engage with the different assessment components that they will be facing and the dates that they will need. We would expect the provider to come to the planning meeting with the availability of the apprentices for those different. So that's the information they need to bring to that planning meeting. It's not something that that they talk about and decide during the meeting. That information they bring. And then it's a conversation between the IEPA and the provider and possibly the employer at that meeting to set those times, dates, and locations for those different assessment components. The meeting will also be the opportunity, as I've said, for the provider, for sometimes the apprentice to meet the IEPA in advance of the assessment, to put a face to the name, which can help with how they feel about sitting that assessment. To set the scene for the assessment, so you know what the assessment components are and what happens within a day, and for the IEPA to flag any important information or considerations they think is important that the provider takes note of. Now, a key one that came up yesterday, and I'm unsure as to whether it's a problem also in your standard, is underlining the timescales for any assessment material, for example, the showcase portfolio, that need to be submitted for. So I think it's within 10 working days, but that planning meeting will be a good opportunity for the IEPA to underline how important that is. Because if they don't submit that assessment, then the subsequent assessments can't take place. So that meeting will be a chance for them to do that. After the meeting, after that particular planning meeting, any changes or rescheduling can take place via a phone call or an email. It's that initial planning meetings where those dates are set. But we will be strongly encouraging our customers, once those dates are set, they need to stick to them. As with our IEPAs, once the planning meeting date is set, is that to make sure that everybody fulfills those commitments, to limit the necessity to keep changing dates and rescheduling events. Okay, now I hopefully have answered Kelly's question. Now, Kelly asked earlier, is there an expected time between accepting the case and the EPA date being booked? Now, the expected time between accepting the case and the planning meeting taking place is 10 days. In terms of the actual assessments taking place, as soon as convenient for the provider and the IEPA, and as soon as possible after that planning meeting is what we need to aim for. So once you're allocated, you will know that there is an expectation that assessment happens as soon as possible. We haven't put a set timescale against that, Kelly, because it will be difficult to tell how flexible the provider can be. But we would like to say as soon as possible, given the conversation between the IEPA and the provider. Hopefully that answers your question. So, Linda, you asked, will the IEPA speak to the provider or the employer or both? So hopefully I've answered that question. It really will depend. It may be the employer too, it may just be the provider. It may also be, the apprentice may also attend the meeting, but that will really depend on the context and how the provider wants to organise that with the employer. I envisage that the vast majority of planning meetings will happen directly with the provider and will be scheduled that way, possibly with the employer. Sorry, Kelly, you've asked another question. I'm going to bring you in at this one. I've got quite a few hands up. Really good questions this morning. Diane, I'm going to bring you in. Put your hand up. I'm going to try and take you off mute if I can. But you have to take yourself off mute. Diane, can you hear me?
If the provider needs to cancel the meeting once it's been scheduled, who are they going to get in touch with?
They'll get in contact. So are we talking about the planning meeting or the assessment, Diane?
The assessment. After the planning meeting's taken place, and then for whatever reason, if it has to be cancelled by the provider, who will they get in touch with?
They will get in contact with the IEPA because it will mean that those dates need to be rescheduled. It will really depend on the when. So we're putting in place quite strict rules around cancellation time. So, you know, it's not acceptable for somebody to cancel on the day and within a certain time scale. But if they need to reschedule, then they will need to contact the IEPA because the IEPA will be able to tell them when they can reschedule for. Now, what I would say is if we're having problems or you're having problems with a particular provider that is unavailable, that wants to keep changing dates, then that's an escalation to the EPA events booking team and they will take that out of your hands because that is a conversation between City and Guilds and the customer about you know, what we need from them and what the process needs from them in terms of firming those dates. And I know across different standards we do have some customers who are not as reliable as we would hope they would be in terms of meeting those dates. So we're aware of that. So rescheduling under certain circumstances is fine and they would contact the IEPA, but if this becomes a problem and it's an issue with them rescheduling and rescheduling, then that is an escalation to the EPA events booking team who will need to speak to the customer. Does that answer the question, Diane?
It does, love, thank you.
Thank you, lovely. I'm just going to put your hand down. I've got a question from Alison Irving. Hello, Alison.
Hello. My question is in relation to the planning meeting go-to meeting. The fact that is it the us that sort out the link for the go-to meeting so we can hold the planning meeting?
So
or would the EPA booking team do that?
So, so in terms of the planning meeting, once we've got the data, I'll talk about the process in a minute. Once the date of the planning meeting is set, the EPA events booking team will set that go-to meeting up for you, and will provide you with you and the other stakeholders with the link. So that will be done for you. Now, what we'd like to do, Alison, is to explore whether that is quicker and easier for the APAs to do themselves. But initially, we envisage that won't change, and the EPA events booking team will continue to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. So Alison's just asked that one. Is there still a signed booking form? Kelly, there isn't still a signed, well, we don't envisage there'll be a signed booking form. So what we envisage is that planning meeting will set the dates, and once those assessment dates are set, they will send out a notification to the customer. But I'll come on to that when we talk about setting the assessment dates. Alison's asked about who sorts out the go-to meeting link. Okay, I'm going to leave the other questions until later on because I think they're relevant to other parts. Okay, so before we move on, in terms of the information on the planning meeting, are there any other questions that people want to ask? Any points they want to raise?
Is there a plan to send to the provider the sort of stuff they need to bring along to the meeting?
Yes.
Is there going to be a notification for them?
Yes, so we'll come on to that. Bill, that was a brilliant segue. Thank you for that. It's almost like we're working as a team.
Oh, no, I won't go as far, don't I?
Right. Okay, so on that point, Bill, nicely done, very smooth. So what I'm showing you now is a sample contact email. So what we'll provide the IEPAs with is that, so we've said that, once they accept an allocation, the next step for them is to set up a planning meeting. And the way that they do that is by contacting the person that they've been given the details for by the EPA events booking team, and proposing some dates for that initial planning meeting. Now, we've put together a sample contact email. Now, just a bit of a heads up, this will evolve based on some feedback from yesterday. But fundamentally, what that sample, that email, that planning meeting email will be, is an explanation of what that planning meeting is about. So, what's the purpose of it? The information that the provider or the employer needs to bring to that meeting. So the information regarding attendees, locations for assessment, etc. Well, they'll need to bring that to the meeting. And also some possible dates for the meeting. So we'd like the IEPA to propose at least 3 options for a planning meeting date. It is remote, so hopefully that gives more flexibility to that activity, but at least 3 options in the first instance. And we also want them in that planning meeting email to confirm who they want to attend. So for them to consider the planning meeting, bring the right information, and then for them to let you know who they want to attend that planning meeting. And that's important because we'll need to set up the go-to meeting planning link to make that meeting take place. As I've said, the planning meeting should take place within 10 days of you accepting the EPA application, and that happens remotely. Any questions at this point? Nothing further, I don't think. Okay, so I'll move on. Okay, so I'm going to explain now the planning meeting process to you in a bit more detail. Again, quite text heavy, and that is really so you can look back through this after the session. I have a question. There is a question. That's a good point. So Tracy raises, how long do they have to respond to the availability of the planning meeting? So if you send 3 dates to the customer, and we don't envisage the planning meeting will take very long, I think somewhere between half an hour and maybe 45 minutes. So that's what we envisage it will take. But what Tracy was asking is how long do you have to hold those dates for? I think what we would probably need to include in that planning meeting email is an expected response time, so when they should get back to you, to encourage the customer to get back to you more quickly. Because quite appreciate, Tracy, if you're holding those dates and you're holding them for a long time, that's not ideal. And we'll make sure that the customer training that takes place, we emphasise how important it is for everybody that they respond to you as soon as possible. I'm just going to write notes on that. Hopefully that answers your question. So yeah, and it's 10 working days. We did agree that. Okay. There's more questions coming in. You're putting questions in faster than I can respond to them. Will IEPAs be set up with City and Guilds email addresses? Not currently. We didn't currently envisage that for beta, Kelly, and I do think we need to look at that depending on beta. That's not currently our plan, but it's a good point, and I will take a note of it. Okay, so I'm just going to skim through to see if there's anything else. And I think for Veronica, that was also the same question. So I'm just going to put those to one side and move on with the session. So, planning meeting days. So, as I've said, as an IEPA, you've accepted an allocation, and you have sent an email, the sample email, to the provider, and they have come back very quickly, within 2 days, to agree the date for the planning meeting. And they've also confirmed who they want to attend that. And for example, they may want the apprentice, but let's assume in this case they haven't. The next step is for you to send a request to the EPA booking team for them to set up a go-to-meeting event for you on go-to-meeting, so that planning meeting can take place remotely. The EPA booking team will set up that event, and the notifications will be sent to the attendees, and the event links will be sent to attendees through GoToMeeting, and that will be based on the information that you provide to them about who is attending. The next stage is that the IEPA then has to set up that planning meeting in EPA Pro. And that basically is about the IEPA logging the date of the planning meeting in EPA Pro and making sure that it is logged there. Now, the reason for that is that initiates the assessment scheduling date. Now, currently, for every apprentice, a planning meeting date has to be set up in EPA Pro. So even if the actual planning meeting takes place with, talking about assessments for more than one apprentice, the IEPA will need to set up an individual planning meeting date for each apprentice, even if it's the same date within EPA Pro. And we'll talk a little bit more about that this afternoon. When we look at the system this afternoon, we'll be showing you how to do that, how to put the date in there. But for every apprentice, they will need currently a planning meeting date. The next step is that the planning meeting takes place, and if the customer has listened to the advice you've given them, they've come to that planning meeting with the right information, and during that planning meeting, assessment dates for all the apprentices being discussed are then agreed. So all the different assessment components in your area, the 3 assessment components, they are agreed. Now, what we're saying initially, especially as this is new, that planning meeting is an occasion where the IEPA would record all the information on a meeting recording form, a planning meeting recording form. So what we're asking the IEPA to do is to attend that meeting, to have the discussion, to agree the dates, and then to note all that information on a planning meeting recording form. And that's just to make sure initially that all that information is captured. After the planning meeting takes place, the IEPA would then take that information and they would then insert it against the apprentice in EPA Pro. So for each apprentice, there may be a number of dates. There might be 3 assessment dates that need to be added against that apprentice record in EPA Pro. So the planning meeting takes place, you take some notes, and then that's added to the system. Now, as we move through the beta, because the system is very intuitive, and because setting assessment dates is quite a simple task, we could envisage that the planning meeting would take place and the IEPA would update EPA Pro as they move through that planning meeting. But initially, what we'd like you to do is to use that planning meeting, record the information, and then to add the information to EPA Pro after that point, because that will make sure, while everything is new, nothing gets missed. If there are any remote events that need to be set up as a result of those assessment dates being scheduled, the IEPA would then send a request to the GoToMeeting team. Now, for customer service, the assessment events are on site, so that won't be required. So once you've got those assessment dates in there, as far as I understand, you won't need to follow the next two steps because there'll be no subsequent GoToMeeting events that need to be set up. I've got a question if that's relevant to the second. Sorry. Okay, so there's a request about the LEPAs being involved in the planning of the standardisation standardisation of the planning meeting. Now, the planning meeting, we don't envisage that the LEPAs will need to monitor what happens at the planning meeting, because it is a conversation around dates. But what we would like to do is we'd like to put some sample scripts in place to give the IEPA some support while they conduct those planning meetings. And certainly our planning meeting recording form will form the basis of that. So all of the information that the IEPA needs to collect in that planning meeting will be on that planning meeting recording form. So that will guide them through the conversation. But I do think it's important, Kelly, that we do talk to LEPAs, and we are having a training session with our LEPAs later in the month about the best way that, for the IEPA to approach that planning meeting. So we will work with you and with some of you at least to get some feedback on that as we move into beta. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so Veronica said we would potentially need a GoToMeeting for remote interviews and professional discussions. Okay, that's a good piece of feedback. So Veronica's just confirmed that in some circumstances, some of those professional discussions do happen remotely. And if that is the case, the last part of this process would need to happen. So the IEPA would set up the assessment dates on EPA Pro, and if a remote professional discussion needs to take place, the IEPA would then send that request to the EPA booking team, and they would set up the event on GoToMeeting, and the notifications would then be sent out to all of the attendants in the same way as it works for the planning meeting. Okay, so as I've said, just to underline, a planning meeting can physically happen, and assessment dates for different apprentices can be discussed. However, when it comes to putting that information into EPA Pro, a planning meeting date needs to be added to each apprentice record, even if one planning meeting is being used to discuss that apprentice's assessment dates. If now the apprentices shouldn't be allocated unless they've passed Gateway, but if it does happen that the Gateway team discover that there's an issue with the Gateway application, because it does happen in parallel to the allocation, and there is a slight risk that a planning meeting may be put in the diary too early, you'll be contacted by the EPA booking team to say that that planning meeting needs to be put on hold and may need to be rescheduled. It shouldn't happen, but if it does, you'll be contacted by the EPA booking team to let you know that. We said initially the EPA booking team will schedule the GoToMeetings. Through beta, we may look to change this, and that really depends on the confidence of you as IEPAs in dealing with the system. So we're going to assess that as we move through beta. We said initially the IEPA will collect all of the key information on a planning meeting recording form and then input the information into EPA Pro. But as you get more confident, we envisage that it might be possible for certain IEPAs to actually input the dates into the EPA Pro directly during that planning meeting event. The date for the showcase portfolio, so when you schedule the assessments, the date that you put, you capture for the showcase portfolio is the date that you will be assessing it, so when you're reviewing that portfolio. Automatically on the system, if the agreement is the portfolio needs to be submitted 10 days before, then the date that you set is the assessment date. The customers will be sent a notification 10 days before that they have to upload that showcase portfolio. So that will help encourage them meet that commitment. Okay, so I'm going to pause. I've got some new questions. I'm going to work through. Okay, so what happens if the meeting is planned and there's not enough time for the EPA team to set up the GoToMeeting link? That is a very good question, Sharon. And I envisage that we will need, we're talking to the EPA booking team over the next couple of weeks. If it is quite a rapid turnaround, we will need some way of escalating that request so that they can prioritise the GoToMeeting links that need to be set up first. So we'll pick that up with the EPA booking team. That's a really good question. Bear with me. Okay. Hopefully that's answered your question. The EPA team will still, Simon, so in answer to your question, Simon asks, does the EPA team still check the gateway before allocation? Yes, it does. Absolutely, the gateway team will be looking at that before allocation. However, I said before, some of the activity may happen parallel to allocation. So if you can imagine that in order to make it as efficient as possible, they will allocate to the IEPAs as soon as they understand that gateway's been passed, but they might expect the IEPA to take a couple of days to respond to that allocation. So there might be a little bit of an overlap. So under certain circumstances, there may be a small risk that is allocated, you accept it, and then they have to check and have to reconfirm that that needs to be put on hold. Now we're going to try and reduce that as much as we can, but I just wanted to raise that might be a small risk. Or something comes up, something's missed in that check, and then they then have to say that has to be put on hold and can't proceed. Just wanted to flag it, but it shouldn't in theory happen. The EPA team would look at the allocation and then it's allocated to the IEPA. But it's a small risk, Simon, and we're going to need to monitor that through beta. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, I think the others are questions I'm going to take later or after the session because they are relevant, but I can't necessarily answer them. And I just wanted to flag that. I may not be able to answer all of your questions today because you're raising some really good questions and they are things that we will need to consider in the next few weeks before we go live. So I will make a commitment though. All the questions that you ask, we will come back to you on either through FAQ or through an updated training pack, training deck that we send out to you. Okay, before we proceed, are there any other questions that people want to raise?
Just the last one. If the upload is late, is there a tolerance where we would look to cancel?
It's a good question. If the upload is late, I think some of it would depend on the IEPA. So if it's a couple of days late, then it's up to the IEPA to decide whether they can accept that and still carry out the assessment and still do the subsequent assessment dates. If it's more than that, I think it's an escalation to the EPA booking team because what we're saying is actually that doesn't leave sufficient time to do the subsequent assessment dates and they will need to be cancelled. So I think we're aware that's a problem. As I said, the customer, we've got a very small group of customers that we're working very closely with on the beta. They're getting a lot of care, a lot of attention, a lot of communications. And part of what we're doing is trying to test out this communication. But a key thing that we are underlining is that if they want the assessments to take place as per schedule, they need to provide the information at the time that we need it. Now, we've got 2 more opportunities to do that. They get a notification as to when they upload the evidence. That's on the system. And secondly, the planning meeting is also the opportunity for the IEPA to say, you know, in order to meet these assessment dates, we absolutely need the evidence at that stage. So, but on top of that, if it is a problem, Bill, and it becomes, you know, puts at risk the other assessments, then that's an escalation to the EPA booking team, and they will need to speak to the customer.
Would it be worth the communication during the planning meeting to have a note on the dates agreed for uploads are critical?
That's a good point. I'm going to make a note of that.
So that the IEPA has that support when it discusses it.
They can't do it. What we can make reference to in the planning meeting email is that they can make reference to remind them about the upload of evidence, but they can't set the date of upload until they've set their assessment.
But if
date.
it's late, it can say it could cause problems.
That's a good point.
Could cause problems with achieving the plan.
Okay, that's a very good point. Okay, I've got another question, so I'm going to proceed to see if that is relevant. So Kelly said, will the IEPA now be allowed to contact the provider the day before to ensure the apprentice will be there for the EPA to go ahead? That's a really good question, Kelly. How we'd envisaged it working is that if the IEPA doesn't turn up, they would be entered as an absence. So, and that would be a clear absence on the platform, and that would be their outcome. What we are hoping is through the customer communication and working with the customer very closely, we would reduce the risk of that happening to a minimum. What I'm going to do is can we take a note of that? Because I think I'd like to explore that and the opportunity to do that, whether that would add real value. So I'm not going to answer your question now, Kelly, it's a good point, but can we take that away for advisement and think about it? Thank you for that. That's a really good question. Really good questions. Okay, it's a good idea to keep them on my toes this morning. Hold on a second. I've got a lot. So will emails be sent? Okay. And there are some other questions on emails which I've said I will come back to possibly after. Right. Any other questions at this point? No, I'm going to go on then. It's always a surprise as to what's coming next on this deck. Oh, right. Okay. So this is again another sample, and we know this will change based on some of the feedback from yesterday, but this is a sample of the planning meeting recording form. We talked about through the beta initially, and as a way of guiding the IEPA through that planning meeting conversation, we'll put together a template, and the idea is that they work through the planning meeting and they will collect the information they need on this template, along with the, you know, whether a go-to meeting is required. Now, we need to amend this, because we need to amend it based on the fact there might be more than one apprentice at that meeting, or we might be discussing more than one apprentice. But that will give you an idea of, you know, the different assessment methods, different contact details, if they're different to what's on the system, because a lot of information is on the system, and also some evidence upload dates. Again, that is underlined in the meeting. So that's the template. And before we go live, we'll finalise that, and that'll be part of the materials that we'll provide to you as we move into go live stage. Okay. Now, I'm going to move over this because actually, for your standards, there isn't an evolve test. So I can swiftly skip over these slides, and I'm very pleased about that because it does make it slightly easier to work through. Okay, so at that point, I think we've done another hour, so I'd like just to take, I'm just checking up what we've got left to cover. I think it would be an appropriate moment to take another break, actually. Again, we're going to break until 20 past 11. So if you want to just stretch your legs and have a break, and we'll come back and we'll work through the last part of the presentation. Hello and welcome back. Hopefully you've got a cup of tea, you've stretched your legs. I know that we have. We're even offered a donut. We haven't gone down that road yet, but maybe this afternoon we'll need one. So, okay. So sorry, I'm starting to witter now. It happens at this time of day. So where did we get to? We ended up looking at what did we end up doing? We were looking at evolve, and I said that that's not relevant, which is great news. So at this point, what I wanted to do is talk a little bit more about what happens once the assessment dates are in place. So as we've said, the planning meeting is about setting the scheduling for those assessments that take place for customer service. In your case, the showcase portfolio, the observation, and the professional discussion. Okay, so let's assume those dates have been agreed. Alongside that, there is also a timescale for uploading the evidence, which the customer will receive a notification on the system. Now, what then happens is that, and this is a sort of generic process, so I'll talk you through it and try and make it relevant to customer service. So we start with evidence being provided by the customer. And in your case, it's the showcase portfolio. And that is provided on EPA Pro, hopefully within the timescales that we have requested and that we need. That is the first step. And then the next step is the assessment actually takes place. Now, for each component, there is some kind of assessment activity, and you as an IEPA, as the subject matter expert, is driving that. So if it is an observation that is taking place on site, you would attend that, you would observe it, you would take your notes, and you would start to get a judgment of that apprentice's ability. If it is a portfolio, you would take the evidence off the platform, you would review that, and you would make a judgment on that portfolio. And the same for the professional discussion. So that assessment activity is where it starts to take place. As part of that assessment activity, what you are then doing is you're completing documentation. You might be completing observation forms for the observation, and that will help you come to your judgment. You might be completing some kind of review of the portfolio form, and again, that is helping you come to your result. Once you have that result, so once you're able to confirm that, and as we've said, Veronica said that for the portfolio, you may not be able to confirm that until you've completed all of the assessments. But once you have confirmed that something is a fail, what you're then doing is you're deciding a result. And if it is a fail, for a particular component, you are preparing some fail feedback for that particular component. And what you will then do with that is you will put the judgment for that assessment component, that assessment method, onto EPA Pro, and you will enter your results. In terms of the documentation, everything that's relevant to that assessment, that apprentice, is saved on SharePoint, because that's the storage area that we're using to put all of the relevant documents that can then be shared with the LEPA. If it is a fail, for a component, what we're also asking you to do is to put that fail feedback attached to a component on EPA Pro, because we can use that mechanism to send that feedback out to the customer. I've got a question, just going to check it to see if it's relevant to. Okay, so Kelly, is there a facility to verify the initial showcase assessment prior to going out? Yes, absolutely, Kelly, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so that is the initial stage for the IEPA. The IEPA is doing the assessment, and they are entering the results, and they are saving the documentation in the right place. Now, what then happens is the quality assurance step. So if the LEPA, if necessary, the LEPA needs to quality assure different parts of that assessment, that information will go to the LEPA, and the LEPA will have the opportunity to look at the results on EPA Pro, look at the fail feedback on EPA Pro, and look at all of the assessment documentation that has been collected by the IEPA in SharePoint, and they will be able to determine whether that result is fine to go. It needs to be confirmed by the LEPA. and the extent of sampling will depend on their sampling strategy. But the LEPA needs to sign off that result. If changes are required to the results or the documentation or the failed feedback, the LEPA would have an offline conversation with the IEPA, and the IEPA would then make the amends to the documentation. They would add any new documentation to SharePoint, so that's the single source of all the information. And if any amends needed to be made to the failed feedback, they would need to remove the initial failed feedback from EPA Pro and replace it with the amended version. And once we've done that, the LEPA could then release the results.
So it lays dormant on the system.
So everything lays dormant on the system until the LEPA approves it. So I think that's similar to the current system. And that would then allow, as Veronica said, so for example, even if the assessor of the IEPA has done an assessment of the portfolio and come to some initial judgment, they could save the documentation in the right place, they could save their judgment. They could then amend their judgment and the forms once they've done that interview. And they don't have to enter a result in EPA Pro until they are happy that's the final result. So it should be the final result they put for that component that they put into EPA Pro. And at that point, it will go to the LEPA. Now, what we might find is for some of the other standards, actually, the components happen further apart. For customer services, from what I understand, is that they will happen closer together. So that quality assurance might be of all the components at the same time rather than individual components. Does that make sense? Mm. Okay. So if it's a pass result, the results will go to the provider. If it's a fail result, then there's the opportunity for a retake. And that retake, what we're asking, if it is a fail, and if it's a component fail, and so one of the assessment components has failed, and that impacts any remaining assessment dates, then there may need to be a rescheduling conversation between the IEPA and the customer. For customer services, that is a bit challenging. So, for example, if in the interview and the professional discussion they conclude that they're both a fail, there isn't anything to reschedule because they're happening at the same time. But the idea is that if there is a fail for one of the components, so for example, if the observation is a fail, it doesn't feel like there needs to be any rescheduling. That's just a result. That the only rescheduling there needs to be is of that observation component. Does that make sense to everybody? I've got a question, so maybe it doesn't make sense to everybody. Let's have a look. We carry out an interim sample of the showcase assessment. Can we sample it without agreeing a grade on EPA Pro and record that interim feedback, or would we send interim feedback to the email via? Okay, Veronica, so currently we're not using the EPA Pro system for the LEPA to provide feedback to the IEPA. That would need to be done offline. So what Veronica was asking is whether you can send a message or you can sample some work that they're doing and send that to the IEPA on EPA Pro. For beta, initially, what we'd like you to do is to do that offline. So it's either a conversation or an email if you're requesting them to change anything. And they would then react to that. So that's where we are for beta. Hopefully that answers your question. Let's have a look. Another question from Kelly. Will the IEPA know? That's from previously, Kelly, I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. I'm just going to try to make that relevant to customer service. I just want to make sure that there are no questions or any hands up at that point, apart from what we've already said. Just to summarise, evidence is provided, assessment takes place, the assessor forms and all the documentation is saved in SharePoint, a result is entered on EPA Pro, and any failed feedback that's relevant would also be entered on EPA Pro for each component. There is a quality assurance stage where the LEPA has a chance offline to give feedback on some of that documentation or the results. And then once the LEPA is happy, those results can go out to the customer. If there is a fail, then the LEPA that might lead to there having to be a rescheduling conversation between the IEPA and the customer. And the customer, if they do fail, they'll be asked to contact the IEPA to reschedule. Or it could be that the IEPA initiates that conversation and contacts the customer and highlights that a certain component will need to be rescheduled in terms of an assessment date. Okay, I'm going to pause again there because there's quite a lot of information there, and I just wanted to make sure that came across in the way I intended. Okay, I'm going to pause. Good. Hopefully silence means we're all with me. So I'm just, and again, we've been through some of this process, but I just wanted to underline what the process will be in terms of documentation. We've already said for BSA there will be 2 systems where we are saving documentation, and that is initially at BSA we will be looking at that and monitoring how that needs to evolve going forward. I just wanted to walk you through the initial process again. So for a particular component, the EPA booking team will upload any GoToMeeting recordings that you have to SharePoint. So we talked about SharePoint being the sort of source of all our assessment documentation. We've talked about the EPA events booking team supporting GoToMeeting. And if any of your assessments take place remotely, which Veronica has said that could happen, then the recording that's taken will be uploaded to SharePoint and the links sent by the EPA event booking team. So they will do that and make sure it's in the correct place. Any assessor forms that you produce as part of your assessment as an IEPA, or any fail feedback relevant to a component, will all need to be saved on SharePoint. That's the single source of all information. But if there's any fail feedback, that will also need to be added to EPA Pro for a component along with the results for that particular assessment component. Once you've done that, the LEPA will receive a notification on EPA Pro and that new materials have been uploaded and that there is material ready to QA. And the LEPA can access SharePoint and can access EPA Pro to do their review and sampling as they need to. If everything is correct, at that point, the LEPA can release the results. And if they do release the results at that point, it means it will go directly out to the customer. Currently, once the LEPA signs something off, there are a number of internal steps that we need to go through to get that result out to the customer. In EPA Pro, in the new world, as soon as the LEPA has signed that off, it goes out and the customer will receive the results. It's a much more rapid turnaround of results. If there are amends to be made, there needs to be an offline conversation between the LEPA and the IEPA, by email, by phone, and then the IEPA will make the amends that are necessary on the forms, on the results, and on the feedback form. Once they've done that, they need to remember to save new versions of the forms, everything on SharePoint. So SharePoint is that single source. And then in terms of any relevant fail feedback, they will need to remove the first version of the fail feedback from EPA Pro and add the new version to EPA Pro. And then as soon as the results go out, the customer will receive that fail feedback if it's relevant to that particular assessment component. And again, that is different to the current process because current process is quite a manual step to get fail feedback to the customer. And in the new process, it will go out directly once the result has been approved. I've got a question. It's a really good question, Alison Atkinson. So Alison Atkinson has said, and I was waiting for someone to say this. So well done, you get the prize, Alison. So Alison said, I'm sure you've thought of this, hopefully we have, but what's the risk of the IEPA being used as support by the provider if they contact them about a failed component? Now, it's a very important question, and I think it's probably one that's bubbling through everybody's minds, because we know that when a provider has an issue, they tend to go to the contact that they feel is most reliable and most knowledgeable. And in the case of a fail, I envisage that they will want to have a discussion about it. But we're being very clear in our communication to our customers that that doesn't happen. The IEPA's role needs to be independent, The feedback they receive is the fail feedback they get through the platform. And in terms of the IEPA, we will be giving them a channel. If they are receiving queries from the provider, we will ask them to channel them through our customer services route, so they can move that query on. Nonetheless, Alison, I think this is something we're going to have to monitor very carefully through beta, and we will need possibly to respond to things as they are evolving. Remember, as an IEPA, you will have a network of support around you. You will have a channel, you can channel customer queries, and we will give you a script to push back queries that are not relevant to your role to that customer services route. Also, there is the EPA event booking team where you can escalate issues to, and they can talk to the customer directly to ensure that we deal with any issues. That's how we're going to deal with it through beta, but I do envisage we'll need to monitor it, because not all our customers behave as we expect them to behave necessarily when it comes to a live environment. So that's a really good question, and I'm really glad you raised it. Hopefully that answers your question. But
one small one. Where we have an EPA makes modifications, and then the stuff on the EPA Pro is updated, is there a need for audit for that that's coming off EPA Pro to be stored anywhere?
It will be stored, because it will already be stored in SharePoint. So any documentation that is added, that is created by the assessor or is created as part of the assessment, will need to be in SharePoint. And then SharePoint has a set of version controls. So when you add new versions of it, it will show the different versions of it. So it will see the evolution of those documents. So that gives us an audit trail if we were to be audited by any of our many regulators, Bill. Okay, all right, I'm going to pause there. Any questions at this point? Any more questions? I will then move on. Okay. And this is a very similar slide, but this talks about the overall growth. We do have a question. We do have an additional question. Sorry, I'm giving it time. Will EPA feedback be on SharePoint for audit purposes? That's a really good question, Kelly, and I need to pick that one up. We've got a bit of work to do still on the EPA training, which is why it's taking place later in the month. But I think that's a really good point you raise, and I think we need to explore, what's possible and what's needed for audit purposes. So leave that one with us, and thank you for raising it. Right. So now this process is very similar in look, but it actually refers to the overall grade. So once the apprentice has completed all of the assessment components within the endpoint assessment, then there is some kind of grade determination of their overall grade. Now, for most of the standards, that involves some kind of grade determination form where the IEPA would bring the different components together, would follow the grading rules, and would derive an overall result. Now, again, as with any documentation, we would like that saved in SharePoint. We would also like it added to EPA Pro. So that documentation needs to be added to 2 places. Again, once that happens and an overall result is entered into EPA Pro, so once they've derived a result, they've saved the documentation, they would enter the results into EPA Pro. The LEPA will then receive a notification, and the LEPA can then quality assure that as required. That's the overall result and how they've derived that result using that grading form. If all is correct, the LEPA can then release the result. And again, that result will go out immediately. Now, the grade determination form that is saved on EPA Pro will stay on EPA Pro, but it doesn't go out to the customer. So that's a piece of documentation that doesn't go out to the customer, but we'd like it saved for beta at least in 2 places. Okay, if the LEPA looks at that grade and there are amends to be made, again, that's an offline conversation with the IEPA. The IEPA would then amend the forms if necessary and the results, and they would then need to save a new version of the form on SharePoint. remove the first version from EPA Pro and add the final version, assuming that amends needed to be made to that. And again, once those amendments have been made, the LEPA can sign that result off and it can go out to the customer. I'm going to pause there to see if there are any more questions at that point. Chris? Sorry, me again. Hi, Kelly. Do you want me to, as a change, so you're typing it in, do you want me to bring you in and you can ask the question? Give me a second. Hi, Kelly. Did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. I'm being quite vocal today. Sorry about that. I was just wondering, you said that the grade form isn't released to the customer. So are they going to be aware of what they achieved in each component or just the overall grade?
Now, they'll be aware of what they received in each component because the component results will go out as well. So with customer service, we said that it could be that everything is bunched together. But initially, the component results, so if you can imagine, as an assessor, let's imagine that you do your showcase portfolio, you think it looks, you know, there are some gaps in it, but you've got to wait until your professional discussion and your interview to confirm that. But you do your observation maybe 2 days before you have that professional discussion, let's assume that in terms of scheduling. You go and do that observation, you then come to a conclusion quite quickly as QA'd, and it's a pass. You put that information into EPA Pro for that component. Imagine the LEPA QAs it. That result would then go out. In terms of the others, you maybe do those things together. So the showcase portfolio and the interview, you do on the same day, you finish those on the same day, you derive the judgments on the same day, you input the results for those individual components onto EPA Pro. As soon as they've been signed off, those results would go out. And then what then happens is that you would then put the results, the overall result in there, and then that result would go out. So what the customer's receiving is a notification of outcomes for the components and a notification of an outcome for an overall result, and hopefully they should match up. And depending on when you complete those assessments and when they're QA'd, it might all happen at once, or it might happen, you know, with days or weeks between them, depending on how the apprenticeship and the assessments are scheduled. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you.
No worries. Okay. Linda, I've got you down with a question. Is that one of the previous questions or is it a new one?
It's what the previous, there's no new one.
Okay, that's fine. Great. I will just come back to your question later. Okay, so any more questions? Hands up at this point. Okay, I'm gonna go on. I'm gonna take a glass of water first, I think. Okay, so right, resits. So if a learner fails a particular component, so once the LEPA has approved the outcome, and if the component goes out, it could be that that particular assessment has to be rescheduled. As I've said, we've asked, you know, the customer where something needs to be rescheduled to contact the IEPA to reschedule that resit. But it could also be that the IEPA can contact the customer. So if, for example, in your cases, the observation happens and it's a clear fail, then it might be that you need to reschedule any existing assessment dates that are in place, and you need to reschedule a resit. Now, I just wanted to check something. I'm going to bring in Veronica, if possible, because Veronica raised it initially. Hello, Veronica.
Hello.
I'm putting you on the spot here now.
Okay.
Okay, so if, for example, in your scheduling, your observation happens
Mhm.
and you have a date in the diary for the interview to take place, and the candidate fails the observation,
Mhm.
would you need to reset the observation before the interview takes place, or does it matter? Because in the details I was given, I was told that the interview had to be the last component.
So in terms of scheduling, the endpoint assessment date, when the IEPA goes out, they carry out a practical observation first, they then carry out a showcase interview, and then they carry out the professional discussion. And the discussion is always the last component to be assessed because it ties everything together. So the IEPA would know after that visit the results of all three components. So
that's assuming, sorry to interrupt you, Maureen, that's assuming that they're all happening on one day. And does it always happen that they happen on one day?
we'd certainly, in the main, they do all take place on the same day. If for any reason the showcase and professional discussion can't take place, it may take place remotely for whatever reason on a different day, but that's you know, it's quite rare and it depends on circumstances. Usually everything is on the same day within that 3-hour booking with the customer. So if the IEPA goes out and carries out the observation and it's a fail, they still carry on and do their showcase interview and carry on and do the professional discussion, come back, make the decisions, and then that would be when you get the results released, and then a resit is then arranged for whatever component failed.
Okay, that's clear. And I just wanted to clarify that, because if things happen on different days and if they happen in advance, I wanted to understand whether it would be necessary to reschedule that last component. But let's, for today, work on the basis it's happening on the same day. So if all of that assessment does happen, then in all likelihood those results will go out together. And when they go out, there may or may not be an individual component that needs to be rescheduled for a resit. Under those circumstances, as we've said, we've asked the customer to contact the IEPA to reschedule for a resit, whatever component it is. But it's also within the IEPA's gift to contact the customer, and we've given an email template to highlight that there's been a fail and to ask them to contact the IEPA to arrange a resit for that individual component. And once that's, you know, when they do have that contact, it is again a scheduling conversation about when that resit can take place. If it's the portfolio, there's a conversation about setting, you know, the assessment date for that. If it is a particular visit, again, that assessment date will need to be rescheduled. So that's how the resits work. Within customer services, it is slightly less complex because it all happens together. With some of our other standards, if a candidate fails a component, that may mean we need to reschedule some of the other assessment dates. But because everything happens together with customer services, it does mean the results go out, and then it's a case of just rescheduling the resit of the component that's been failed. Does that make sense? And are there any questions at that point? I just wanted to clarify that with you, Veronica. Okay, hopefully that's clear for everybody. Okay, we're nearly there. Okay, so just to let you know that there may be situations where the customer decides to withdraw or cancel an apprentice's EPA, and they can do that. We have cancellation fees and we have cancellation policy in place for our IEPAs. But the customer may do that on the platform. So they have the option to cancel or withdraw an apprentice's EPA. And if they do that, depending on the option they take on EPA Pro, that may impact the work that you've been allocated. You might see two differences. You might see that the status of the apprentice changes and that all of the assessment dates are cancelled. Or it could be the status will change and the assessment dates are still in the diary. So what we've decided to do, if the customer decides to cancel or withdraw, they will let the EPA booking team know, and then you will be informed by the EPA booking team about any cancellation or withdrawal. They will highlight that to you so you can make sure that you then amend or cancel any of the assessment dates that you've got blocked out. It's just really to highlight, because if the customer can do something on the platform and they don't let you know we need a way of highlighting that to you because we don't want you to attend and hold time in your diary that you don't need to. So the cancellation policy is the same, but in terms of a process where there is a cancellation or withdrawal, the EPA booking team will highlight that to you as the allocated IEPA. If an apprentice doesn't turn up for an assessment, whether it's a remote assessment or on-site one, then you should register their assessment as an absence on EPA Pro. There may be conversations with the EPA team. I think it's important that it's highlighted to the EPA booking team as well. There may be conversations about rescheduling, but the initial assessment date needs to be registered as an absence on EPA Pro, and I think that's important. And the point that you raised, Kelly, about whether we insert into the process the opportunity for the IEPA to make contact the day before, I think we need to clarify and confirm, but we will come back to you on that point. But if there is an assessment scheduled and they don't turn up, then it's an absence. It's on the EPA Pro platform. Any questions at this point? And then finally, and this is again slightly different probably for customer service. So potential malpractice, it's not identified very often, but if it is identified, it should be identified as soon as it's spotted. Now that might be at a component level. As soon as an IEPA spots any malpractice, whether it's in the showcase portfolio or some other, it should be flagged to your LEPA as soon as possible. Now I've said at a component level, so if it occurs in one of your initial components, it should be flagged as soon as you spot it. The LEPA would review and then raise that directly with the investigations and compliance team that we have internally. And then the INC team, investigations and compliance, will contact the customer to explain that an investigation is taking place. And it might very well be at that point that the INC team would also contact the IEPA to say if there are any assessment dates scheduled, they may need to be put on hold or postponed. That really depends on the outcome of their investigation. And it's important, and if you've got dates in the diary and you do flag something, it's important that you get that notification as to whether you need to proceed or hold, and the INC team will provide you with that. If there isn't any malpractice, and it's not identified, it's confirmed as being no malpractice, the INC team will notify the IEPA, the LEPA, and the customer, and then the IEPA will be free, and the LEPA will be free to proceed with that assessment. And that might require rescheduling some of the assessment events if they've been put on hold. I just wanted to give you a quick heads up for that. We don't get many, but if they do happen, that is what we foresee to be the process. Any questions at that point? Okay, we're nearly there. So you've done very well. We should be finishing in the next 5 minutes, so hopefully a bit ahead of schedule. And really, just the next slide is about timescales for completing activity. And some of these are the same as they currently are, but I just wanted to flag them to you. So the IEPA will accept an allocation, assuming they accept an allocation that's been given to them. They then have 10 days to set up and for a planning meeting to take place. So we're aiming for a sort of 10 working days for that to happen. Once for each component, and I think this is the same as it currently is, there's a 3-day turnaround in terms of assessment. So if an assessment date is scheduled, there are 3 days for the IEPA to carry out the assessment, to complete the documentation, and to release the result to the LEPA. And then subsequently, the LEPA will have 3 days to do their part of the process, to quality assure, to give feedback if necessary. And once that happens, if they are happy with the result and the paperwork, then the result will go directly out to the customer. So this final stage is much more immediate. It happens very quickly. So it's really important that when the LEPA signs anything off, we are completely happy with that result, because there will be no time, and that result will go directly out to the customer. Just wanted to flag that. Okay, so you made it to the beginning, to the end of the morning session. So we've talked a bit about beta, what the beta is. We talked a lot about the processes and the changes to the processes, the function of the planning meeting, the different systems that we'll be using, and how the IEPA needs to proceed through the assessment and save documentation. We've had lots of really good questions. I just wanted to ask whether before we close for lunch, whether there are any additional questions that you want to flag on anything that was raised this morning. I will try and go through, if there are any questions I can answer now, I will. If not, we will defer them to after. So I've got a few questions. Let's have a little look. So Kelly said, me again, don't worry Kelly. Are we still stating 20 working days to the customer? No, we're not stating 20 working days to the customer. I don't know the exact timetable that we are stating, but stating 20 working days. That 20 working days includes a lot of internal processing and reviewing of activity and pushing results from one system to another. So the customer will be given an indication that they will get their results much more quickly. I can't tell you exactly what the SLA will be, but we've put together a timeline for them from when they make the booking with an indication, you know, assuming they are flexible with their scheduling, all of those things, that, you know, once those assessments are complete, the results will go out in a much shorter time frame. I hope that answers your question. Kelly, come back if it doesn't. About emails. So I've got a few questions about email addresses. Have we made a note of those, Jane? So the first one is whether we're using City and Guilds email addresses, and the second one is will there be guidance on email accounts? I think it's a good point. Have we made a note of Veronica's second question, Jane? If we have it, can we? Because Veronica and the other person that raised it was, yeah, the other person that raised it, I think. What we'll do in terms of the email question, we'll come back to you on that. I think we need to have some discussions internally on that. Linda, you raised the question, will the IEPA speak to the provider or the employer or both? And I think I've answered that question, hopefully. If I haven't, just raise your hand. Kelly, you raised a question on new IEPAs to the process. I think we'll pick this up in LEPA discussions next week. If we can make a note of your questions. Your question was around what support the IEPA would need from the LEPA. And I think we can explore that further in the specific training that we're doing for LEPAs. As long as we've got a note of that question.
Yeah, because we have got a mixture of red, amber and green.
Yes. Okay, so
and some are new, so some of those may not have had EPAs yet.
So we need to discuss sampling strategy, and also we need to discuss what support that we can give to the IEPA through that process. So we can pick that up separately. Thank you for that, Kelly. Kelly, your next point, key point would be a time that is best for maximum customer interaction. I'm not sure what you mean by that. So can you come back to me on
Well, I think
what that
that's
means?
to do with when they do the observations, no good going to customer place when it's empty.
Yeah.
Kelly,
which we've had.
let me let you respond to that. Take me off mute. Can you explain what you mean by that one?
Yeah, just one of your earlier slides about the planning meeting, talking about relevant details to be talking about. That's when I raised that point about making sure that when you're booking the endpoint assessment date and time, that's a really good opportunity for the IEPA to ensure that that observation is going to be carried out at a time that's best for the learner to demonstrate their skills and not a quiet time in a shop or something like that.
That's a really good point. We talked about that planning meeting being a moment when the IEPA could flag important information. I think for your standard, that's the classic actually, so thanks for raising that. That's really useful. Kelly, you raised it that there is still a signed booking form. As far as I know, there isn't a signed booking form, but what we're looking to do is to make sure the customer signs up to those dates that they set with the IEPA through the system. So can you leave that question with me? Because that is something that we'll need to pick up with the EPA-led booking. So I'm just going to come back to you on that question, if that's all right. We talked about email addresses. You've got a note of that one, haven't you, Jane? We'll come back to you on email addresses. Kelly, you raised the point about contacting the provider the day before. We'll come back to you on that point. Sorry, me again. Okay, so if they have to, so Simon's asked, if they have 10 days to hold a planning meeting, how much time is allowed for the actual assessments to take place? Okay, Simon, we've said 10 days for the planning meeting to take place. If we can, I'd like it to happen sooner. If it can happen within a couple of days, that would be great. But what we've allowed 10 days only because, I mean, ideally it would be within 5, only because we don't know how quickly the IEPA, the provider, will respond to the planning meeting request. We don't know how easy it is for us to get a time in the diary, especially if they want to, to invite other people to that meeting. So we've said 10 days, but actually it's the same as the assessments. It's as soon as physically possible, given the diary limitations of the IEPA and the provider and everybody else involved. As I've said, we haven't put a timeline in for the assessments because that depends on lots of things, but we will need to assess this through beta to see how quickly we're able to turn these things around. And the rule generally is as soon as possible, as soon as scheduling and diaries allow, should be the target. Hopefully that answers your question, Simon, but I'll come back to you if it doesn't. So Veronica, this talks about the LEPA feedback. Now, somebody, I think it might be you, Veronica, said for audit purposes, should we keep a note of the feedback we provide to IEPAs? I think the answer to that is likely to be yes, but we will come back to you on that because that's part of the discussion that we have internally about how we make that work. Whether it's possible to use anything on the system to support with that, or whether we have to do that off the system. So leave that one with us and we'll come back to you on that. And have you got a date for that LEPA training? I chased this yesterday, Kelly, so I will just check whether that's been done today and we'll come back to you on that hopefully today or tomorrow. Training date. Simon, you come back to me. I'm going to bring you off mute, Simon, because I'm not sure I understand the question. That's probably me being a bit cooked after quite a long session. Just give me a second to find you and take you on mute, and then you can ask me. Hi, Simon. Do you want to tell me your question?
Yeah, I understand there's 10 days for them to do the planning meeting, and of course you could do it much quicker, but I'm just thinking about the timescale for the actual assessment to take place from the planning meeting. And just a bit of a concern that if they're taking a lot of work, then they could be keeping customers waiting for 2-3 weeks or more before they've got an available date to carry out the actual assessment. So is there a timeline or a deadline when it should be?
The deadline is as soon as possible. I think what might be helpful, and again we can take this. I'm just going to make a note of this as well. Jane, you can make a note because I'm just scribbling. I think the key thing is as soon as possible, Simon. But we might have to give IEPA some kind of guideline that if it's even difficult to schedule those dates, and that they're going beyond a certain timescale, we may need to reconsider that reallocation. I don't know at the moment how flexible these customers will be through the beta. I mean, they are aware of the beta, they are aware of this scheduling. So I'm not going to answer it now, but I take your point. My answer at the minute is as soon as possible, but I appreciate that, you might need some guidance. If it's taking too long, at what point does it become necessary to say, I can't manage this, it needs to go to another IEPA? So can you leave that with me? Is that okay?
I think it's an important point because obviously if they're the one with the contact with the customer, then the customer's really at their mercy.
At the IEPA's mercy?
Yeah. If they're dragging it out because they've got a lot of other work on and they're trying to keep the work but can't fit it into a certain time scale. And
I agree. The EPA booking team, as I said, they have a role supporting this, and part of what that will be is actually running reports into how the event is progressing. So there are certain SLAs and there are targets that assessment happens as soon as possible. but they will be monitoring, the speed. So if an assessment hasn't moved, if there are not assessment dates in the diary, or if it moves ahead too slowly, then they will be able to see that. And that's a conversation they can have with the IEPA, or it's a conversation they can have with the customer. Equally, the customer will have, the EPA booking team as an escalation point, and customer services. So if they are concerned, they'll have the opportunity to raise that with Untitled. But let's have a think about what other guidance we might want to put around that to encourage the IEPAs to do that as soon as possible. Thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, is there anything else from anybody before we close for the morning? Pause a bit longer. If there is, just put your hand up and I can bring you in. Okay, I think we're okay. So hopefully that's been clear for you. Hopefully you've had the chance to think about how it will work with the new way of delivering the service. You may have more questions, and you might have more questions this afternoon. So this afternoon is a chance for us to take those processes that we talked about this morning and to put them into practice on EPA Pro. So we'll be doing a walkthrough of the system, and we'll be doing the activity that we've spoken about this morning on the system together, and demonstrating that for you to give you a chance to see how intuitive the system is, and for you to flag any concerns that you've had. So we'll start that session at 1:30, and it should run for about 2 hours, so we should be able to finish a little bit earlier this afternoon. But just to say thank you so much for the engagement this morning. You've been absolutely brilliant. Really, really useful questions and some really good insights. And all of this will just help us improve, the support materials and our approach going forward. I know it's tough listening for so long, but thank you so much. You've been brilliant. So have a good break, and I will speak to you at 1:30.